Good morning, my name is Phil Adamo. I'm the chair of the history department here at Augsburg College. And on behalf of President Paul Pribenow and Dean Barbara Farley, I'd like to welcome you to the 2011 Humanities and Fine Arts Convocation at Augsburg College. I'd like to extend a special welcome to the Lutheran bishops, the retired Lutheran bishops and their spouses who are with us here today. I think there are about 500 of them. We were able to squeeze in a few more people on the edges of the theater, so we welcome them and welcome to all of you. As a medieval historian, I'm very tempted to introduce today's speaker as a Renaissance man, and that would not be too far from the truth. David Carlyon has a bachelor's degree in American Studies from the University of Michigan, a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley, a PhD in theater from Northwestern University. He's been a firefighter, an MP in the Army. He sold beer at Philadelphia's Vets Stadium, and all of those experiences have led him to become an actor. The actors in the audience should be enjoying that little inside joke. He's acted in New York City and regionally around the country, especially in productions of Shakespeare. He's also been a director, in particular with Joseph Papp's Riverside Shakespeare Company and at the Actors Studio. He has taught acting at the universities of Michigan, at Brown University, and at Carnegie-Mellon. I first met David 35 years ago when we were in college together. We were in Clown College. Clown College is a very interesting and strange experience. It's a 2-month intensive training program, kind of like summer camp, but you are learning all of the skills that you need, hopefully to get a contract and tour as a clown with the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, which David and I both eventually did. I remember David from clown school as a very smart clown, and being a smart clown is something that's very important. David was never satisfied just to be hit in the face with a pie. He always wanted to know the interior motivation, the psychology and philosophy of the humor before that pie smacked into his face. He was that sort of thinking man's clown, and I think that made a difference in his performance and made his performance much funnier in many, many ways. For a long time, I thought I was the only clown who ran away from the circus to become a historian, but now I've discovered that's not the case. David has used all of his experience with the circus and as a clown to become a historian of the circus and a historian of clowns, and he's put that to good use. What you will notice in David's work, this very fine book, Dan Rice, the most famous man you've never heard of, but we're about to hear from him. This is a very nuanced study of a man and his times, and reveals David's gifts as a writer and historian, gifts that you'll witness today in his presentation. Dan Rice, 19th century clown, representative American, is the topic today, and I'm pleased to welcome and introduce you to David Carlyon.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil, for all of those wonderful lies you told about me. And thank you to the musicians. I was telling them last night, I heard them rehearsing. Louis Gottschalk was the first famous American composer, and I'd heard CDs of him. I've never heard it live before, so that was a huge treat. Thank you, Spencer and Elijah and Paul and Jill. It's just terrific. Actually, hearing that sort of gets me to one of the themes of my talk. The 19th century, amusements were mixed. Now that would be considered classical music, and in a way it was considered classical music then. But it was also the kind of thing that everybody would hear, because everybody went to everything. Now that's perhaps a bit of an overstatement. Not everybody went to everything, but on the other hand, everything was available for all groups, all ages, all classes, all races, men, women. So there was a blending of culture. But I want to conclude my thank yous, I want to thank you for coming and Augsburg College for inviting me. This is really cool for me. Sunday I was speaking in New Jersey to 6 people. When I said, by the way, when I said I was coming to Augsburg, 2 of the women of the 6, a third of the company, perked up. They were Lutherans. You'd thought I was coming to the Lutheran Vatican. You're going to Augsburg? They were very excited. So, I have to start by saying I'm not sure why I'm here. Now, before those who invited me panic, let me rephrase. It seems to me a public event is a public conversation, and though, of course, I'm the one with the microphone, I'm the one doing the talking, I want to figure out why I'm here. I want to figure out why I'm in Augsburg. I want to figure out, while I'm talking with you, what Dan Rice, 19th century circus, 19th century culture means to all of us. When Phil invited me, he asked for a theme. So I reverted to my favorite poet, Theodor Retke, another Lutheran, and one of my favorite poems, The Waking, the first stanza. And I learned by going is my overall theme, because it seems to me it's the theme of 19th century America. Now, here's the guy. That's Dan Rice. Just for historical information, a daguerreotype, 1849. He's grinning. Think about all of the pictures you've seen of people from the 19th century. You posed. For one thing, it was a long pose because it was a long exposure. But everybody is very stern. It's not just the Swedes and the Norwegians who are stern. All 19th century portraits from about that era, for the most part, very solemn. Dan Rice was, and not just because he was a clown. He was, that was his personality. Now, so my general topic is learn by going. That will refer to Dan Rice's I'll get to. It refers to the 19th century circus. And it refers to 19th century America. But it occurs to me as I'm about to pause again, I've got about 5 introductions here, or prologues, before I get to the point. But this one is important too. When you think of circus and you think of clowns, you think of a big red nose, floppy shoes, an entertainment for children, right? The 19th century circus was very different. Most of the elements were there, most of the same spirit was there, but it was an adult entertainment. So, keep your minds open away from Bozo and Ronald McDonald. Learn by going. In 19th century America, they had a, now I'm starting to feel like one of those TV preachers. I told the cameraman I'd go down here too. Can you follow me? Okay, so 19th century America had this phrase called starting lanes. And the idea was that the original idea was that there were different ways you could go, different tasks, different jobs, different vocations. But implicit in that plural, starting lanes, is the idea that no one was quite sure if the lane they were in would be the lane they ended up in. You started and you succeeded, or you started and you failed and you tried again. That's what starting lanes underneath really means. And that was 19th century America. So you had it, so the context for the circus I'll be talking about is this, the striving, the attempt, the failing, and starting again. That is the history of immigration in this country. So in the 19th century, you had, like I recently read Willa Cather. Read Willa Cather. It's gorgeous work, and it's, O Pioneers, a beautiful look at the high plains, it was Nebraska, but the Germans and the French and the Swedes and the Norwegians there in Nebraska trying to make a go of it, many of them failing and leaving, but many of them staying and making it work. So you had the Lutherans coming to Michigan, like Theodore Roethke's family, and you had the Norwegians coming to Minnesota. I don't know if any of you recognize this. I got it off the Augsburg website. These are early Augies. And they too, now this is later, they've got a car, but Augsburg is what, 1869? It's the immigrants coming and trying to make something work with no guarantee. That's one of the beauties of Willa Cather's books. Some failed, some succeeded. The ones who failed didn't just disappear, they tried again. Starting lines. Trying, seeing if you make it, if not, trying again. And then 200 miles downriver from here, McGregor, Iowa, there were the sons of a man named Ringling, who became the Ringling brothers. They saw Dan Rice, and they started their circus, which at first was just a little hall show. So, a little bit about the circus. Now, you've got the image I talked about, that traditional image, the big circuses. Circus started as an experiment in about 1770 in England. A man named Philip Astley started what we now consider the circus. It was a combination of the human-animal partnership of writing, acrobatics, and comedy. That's the circus. There are other things called circus, lots of other things called circuses, but that's the traditional sense of circus. But he was advertising his writing lessons. He didn't intend to start a new form. In the United States, 1793, John Bell Ricketts in Philadelphia started the first American circus. George Washington went to see it. I mentioned the human-animal partnership. George Washington went to see it because of that human-animal partnership. That is, America, for most of its history, was horse-based. And our language reflects that. Horse sense, horse trader, horse of a different color. It reflected the fact that horses were companions, they were power, horsepower, they were fun, they were for racing, and also they were the 19th century version of the 1950s version of parking in the car, of teenagers going in the back seat of the car. The one-horse open sleigh, that's a sort of dirty song because it's about going out away from the adults, away from authority figures, out in the snow where you have to huddle up together under a blanket, and it's dark out. You're all the way away from town, and things might happen. And that's really what that song is about. So the country was horse-based. But the circus offered an opportunity that attracted George Washington to see this partnership of human beings and animals elaborated, extended. What can these people do with the intelligence of the animals and the intelligence of the trainers? It was a huge draw. But, as I said, it was an experiment. It wasn't clear what circus was. For 30 years, you had to advertise in your advertisements what it was you were offering, because you couldn't say circus because it wasn't called a circus yet. If you go on the web and look up circus, they talk about the first American circus, and we think that means that word was used. Circus meant occasionally the ring, the building. It didn't refer to the form, and it didn't refer to the troupe. There was no such thing as a circus troupe. It was advertised as an equestrian exhibition. It was advertised as an amphitheater. Come see the amphitheater. Obviously, it referred to the space, but it was the same invitation. It was also sometimes called an Olympic. Now imagine what would happen if that name caught on and what we now think of as circus became the Olympics. So an 1896, when they started the modern Olympics, they would have been stuck for a name, because Olympics would have been taken. They might have called the Olympics circus. So about 1824, I'm sorry if I'm too specific on dates. I mean, I kind of live in the 19th century, so these to me are like the difference between 2010 and 2008. So 1849 for me is totally different than 1854. It's just totally different. So I tend to think that way. Don't worry about the dates. But about 30 years after that first American whatever it was, they first called a troupe a circus, and the name stuck. And within a year, all of those exhibitions were circuses. That was also about the time that they had a new technological innovation, the lightweight canvas tent. So now shows could travel. We think of shows, circuses, as tents going from town to town, the good old-fashioned image. They started as urban institutions. You would play circuses, whatever those things were, would play in theaters. For instance, the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia, where I did a couple shows. Dan Rice performed there. Circuses performed there. The theater is still there. You would come to town, you'd go to Charleston, for instance, and you'd build an arena. And then you'd tear it down and sell the lumber back. So it was totally urban institution because for one thing, the major thing, there wasn't an audience. The country was spread out. There weren't that many people, certainly not enough to sustain an amusement. But with the growth of the country and the lightweight tent, and now a name, circus, it started to spread. But it started at, now this one is Dan Rice's amphitheater. He had this theater, where he presented his circus in New Orleans. And sometimes, now this is from a postcard, so it's not real clear. I've never found the original photograph. But you would perform, when you had a tent, you would perform wherever you could. Some towns had a square, a green, where you could set up, a lot, just an empty lot, and then keep it that way. Or you'd set up outside of town. The trouble with setting up outside of town is that meant you didn't have to pay the license, but it also meant you got absolutely no legal protection. They weren't real fond of outsiders anyway. So you tended to swallow and pay the license. Here, Jamestown, New York, 1864, during the Civil War, up in the upper left-hand corner, there is an arrow pointing to, there's the tent, sort of wedged in where it can be, and then to the right, right in the center, another small arrow, that's what's called now called the sideshow, the outside show, because it was outside the main tent. So you'd squeeze into a town. So, essentially, for the first 30, 40 years of circus in the United States, it was still an experiment. It was still in its starting line. What is this institution? What does it involve? Then in the 1840s, 1850s, it came into full flower. But it came into full flower, and here's, there's a bit of an exaggeration here. That is a long-standing circus tradition, exaggeration. But I use it for the historical point that tents that toured were not these tiny little one-ring affairs that seated a few hundred people. Now, he claimed this tent in 1854 seated 10,000 people. Probably not 10,000, but certainly thousands. Well, actually, go back here. See that tent up there? Compare it to the buildings there. Through the 1840s and 1850s, circus tents were the largest structures in the United States. So, if it didn't seat 10,000, it seated thousands. And the appeal of the circus, the reason thousands went, it was an adult entertainment. When a show came to a rural area, children would go because they had to go somewhere. but it was consciously presented as and accepted as and thought as strictly for adults. Kids could come, but in the same way that kids might sneak into, say, an R-rated movie. It was for adults. It had these interesting animals. Again, the animal-horse, the human-horse partnership. This was Dan Rice's trained horse, Excelsior, would walk up and down stairs. Again, a slight exaggeration, maybe 6 stairs and not the, 40 stairs they show there. But that center image, it was trained to stand on a platform and be carried into the ring. Now imagine training a horse to stand like that, not quiver, not jump off, be carried in, that's not stable, be set down, and then perform the act. It was a highly trained horse. People were interested in that. Now, I gotta confess, when I was a clown with the circus, even before that, the horse acts didn't do much for me. However, as a historian, and beyond that, I appreciate the skill going into that. And it's not just that image that started to develop of the human being dominating the animal. It was a partnership. So people came for the animals, including the tightrope walking elephant. Again, an exaggeration. That elephant was probably about this big, and it was probably about that far off the ground. And parenthetically, just so you know, there's a bit of a controversy. Dan Rice claimed that this elephant, Lalla Rookh, by the way, are there any 19th century literature scholars here? No Thomas More? Thomas More? Anybody? Nobody? Darn. Lalla Rookh is the title of a Thomas More poem. And was made into a play. So, the claim was the elephant walked a tightrope. The main elephant guy in the country right now, Buckles Woodcock, who was on the show when I was on the show, on Ringling, that is, has told me you can't train an elephant to walk a tightrope. And other guys who know the mechanics of circus say you can't rig something like that to support an elephant. However, just as a historian, sort of the choices you make as a historian, in a footnote I explained that people disagree, but I kept it in the book because there were lots of critics of circus, lots of criticism of circus. Dan Rice especially. He was a lightning rod. He was immensely popular, but there are lots of people who didn't like him and didn't like that he was popular. It's interesting to read the criticisms. We'll often say, it's such a shame that he's so popular. That is, he's bad, and those people who are going to see him are bad. Any Twain scholars here? Have you read Twain? He played Hannibal, and there were some comments in Hannibal about Dan Rice, which have been taken as factual accounts of his circus rather than critics who didn't like him. But in all that criticism, nobody ever said the elephant didn't walk the rope. To me, that's strong evidence. Because if you're going to complain about Rice, you complain about everything you can. The way he looks, what he says, his attendance, the people on his show, nobody ever said, that's a humbug. As for Buckles and my other 20th century circus friends, maybe it was rope on a plank. I don't know. But nobody ever complained. In any case, it was a highly trained animal. So if you don't believe it, walk the tightrope. And then he had the comic thing, the educated mules. By the way, Stars and Stripes. We'll come back to that. See his, can you see there his outfit? He's got Stars and Stripes. Oh, yeah, Stars and Stripes there. Okay, just keep that in mind. Now, circus was also an adult entertainment because it was full of sex, violence, and politics. You went to the circus to hear the clown's dirty jokes. You went to the circus some for the, how do I say this as a careful historian? There were hints of prostitution. That these people who performed were available for other things afterwards. I didn't find any evidence of that. but the hints were too common to be totally dismissed. But the reason the hints were so strong, and the reason people went wasn't just for the clown's dirty jokes. You saw more skin at the 19th century circus than you would see anywhere else in your life. Walt Whitman went to the circus, went to see Dan Rice's show in Brooklyn in 1856. See, I just love those dates. You don't care from 1856, but I do. 1856. It's before the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's after those early 10. That's how my mind works. So Walt Whitman went, and he said, well, he said one thing. College professor is, circus clown is the other half of a college professor. I kind of like that. He also said it would do no harm to boys to see the limbs of a well-muscled acrobat. Now, for the Whitman scholars in the crowd, there has been a lot of study in the past 20, 30 years that Walt Whitman was either gay or homosocial. That is, homosexual means sexual relations. Homosocial means that your primary orientation, your fondness, your aesthetic eye is for men. So that was Walt Whitman. So when he's saying it's it would be good for boys to see that, he's talking about himself, seeing those well-muscled acrobats, wearing, by 19th century standards, virtually nothing. Tights were called fleshings for a reason. It's still a trick they do in the circus. They have, especially the women, they have like these cut-out peekaboo kind of costumes that are backed by flesh material. But at a distance, it looks like that skin with just a few pockets of material. But it's the circus and it's family affair, so nobody thinks about it explicitly. But the circus knows what sells. I don't want to dissuade anybody going from the circus. It's totally clean now. It is a visual pleasure for some. It was especially a visual pleasure. Now, I give a talk called Circus, 19th Century Circus, Sex, Violence, and Politics. So I've got a bunch of pictures. One of the standard pictures of circus, posters, and you saw it on posters. You look at old circus posters, I knew I could use this chair. It's a woman, an equestrienne, on horseback in an arabesque. Wasn't that a lovely arabesque? With her leg and petticoat like this. And usually in these pictures, okay, so here's the woman, and here's the clown, looking up. Her skirt. Now, nobody's ever noticed this before because people think of the circus as this totally innocent thing. But I began to notice, not only is this a common image in the 19th century, it almost always has a person down there, sometimes a ringmaster, but usually the clown, looking up her skirt. And if you follow the eye, it's going right up her skirt. It's really quite striking. The circus knew that, in advertising, sex sells. But that's what you were going to see at the circus. You were going to see, she looks pretty fully dressed for today's standards. But that picture itself was shocking stuff. And there also, you can't quite see it, but just to the left of her, there's a man, and I think it says on a mash, which was old-fashioned slang. Some of you may remember, it's not that old. A masher, somebody who comes on to women when they're not that thrilled about the idea. And these other pictures, and the one on the upper right-hand corner, there are the two women in their dressing room getting ready for the performance. And you see that guy looking in the window? See, right between the two women in that upper right-hand corner. So the circus was full of sex. That's why people went to see it. They went for the animals, they went for the spectacle, but they went for sex. They also went for violence. Here's the scene, a bunch of guys on a Saturday morning get all liquored up and then go watch men run into each other and smash each other. We call it Football Saturday. They called it fighting. That's what you did in the 19th century. People drank a lot. It was a very violent age. Do I have, oh yeah. This is what is usually called the Astor Place riot. A riot usually blames the rioters, but the rioters got shot at and killed. So I call it the Astor Place killing. Any 19th century historians want to talk about that, I'd be happy to talk about that. But it's a representation. At the circus, you expected violence every day. You were on the road, and you had to be what one circus veteran called an efficient fighting unit, because you were outsiders coming to town. Our vision of this nice, sweet, innocent thing, and oh, the circus is coming, everybody's happy to see the circus. I mean, look at any movie that has a circus in it, look at any TV commercial. Oh, everybody loves the clowns. Everybody loves the circus. Guys are tired of fighting each other all year long. Here comes fresh meat. So almost every day a circus was on tour, they had a fight. And it wasn't just harmless fisticuffs. People were killed. There was a Hippodrome War in Ohio in 1853. 4 days long. The circus couldn't extricate itself to get out. People were killed. So it was a very, very violent age, probably because there was lots of drinking. 5 gallons of hard liquor a year per capita, everybody, man, woman, and child in America in the 1850s, which is about 5 times what we have now. Well, it was the only safe beverage. You drank water, you could get sick. Alcohol was safe. So, that was, oh gosh, I'm way off there we go. So, that's the background of circus. Now, Dan Rice, his own starting line. Who here has a blog or some kind of web presence? Okay, a bunch of you. That's what amusement was like in the 1840s and 1850s. You played in a barn. You know, somebody had a fiddle. People sang. That's how Dan Rice started. He started as, he was a stagehand, I mean, he was a stable hand, and he started singing. He tried various starting lines. He was a strong man on a traveling show. He was a comic singer. He presented a learned pig. Pigs are very smart. They're very good to use in performance. And then he met his wife, Maggie, a partner, and in my mind, an anchor. And he became a clown on a circus. Now, circuses, and here the date is kind of important. 1843, the first minstrel show. There had been representations of blackface before that, individual performers. But minstrelsy started in 1843. What most historians, as far as I can tell, all historians of minstrelsy, scholars who study the form, have missed is that it emerged out of circus. Circuses had whiteface clowns and blackface clowns. And here is, with the racist stereotypes visually, Dan Rice was on Congo Tambo. D. Emmett, banjo melodist, was a rode Dixie. So for a few years, the clown had both. But as Dan Rice became famous, again we got the Stars and Stripes, he became the American humorist. So he would appear in clown costume, what we think of clown costume, what they thought of as clown costume. But he also, as American humorist, was trying to become respectable. So he appeared like this, in the ring, the great American humorist. And he said, this isn't a circus, this is Dan Rice's great show. I argue that the greatest show on earth, his agent later became the agent for Barnum and Bailey when they became the greatest show on earth. So I believe that Dan Rice's great show morphed into the greatest show on earth, or the name rather. But again, it's circus and it's Dan Rice. What works? What pleases the crowd? What makes sense? What can I do that connects with the crowd? So he had, one of the things he did, so you've got the traditional, in the upper right-hand corner, the traditional acts in the circle, highly trained animals. There's Excelsior, they're the educated mules. And then he's got the magic ring. This is a spectacle in the circus ring with, it claims to be 100 auxiliaries, a full court of ballet, which, by the way, was itself a kind of inside joke, because ballet girls at the time were considered strippers, just a half step, if that much, above prostitutes. Because what did ballet dancers do? They showed off their legs. They stripped for money. They were strippers. So, to our eye, a full court of ballet sounds kind of highfalutin. At the time, it was a wink to the audience. Yes, you'll see women's legs. Come on down. But the spectacle itself, fire, water, and this was in a theater. This wasn't in a tent. This was in the National Theater in Philadelphia. He tried to make himself respectable and tried to fit the, there he had a coat of arms, Philios Momas, son of Momus, the Greek god of ridicule. There he's chasing away deathly cares. Again, stars and stripes. His wife divorced him, married, he was lousy with money. His wife divorced him and married his treasurer. I think there's something in that. But she married a younger man, he married a younger woman, same age as his daughters. They weren't fond of that, and neither was her family. They came from a small town, Girard, Pennsylvania, in the northwest corner of Pennsylvania. And he was a threat to their respectability. When her father died, in his will it specifically said, none of my money will be used for Dan Rice's debts. And actually, that respectability still goes on. A descendant of Rebecca contacted me, is really angry at me, and she sent a page-and-a-half single-spaced email to somebody who reviewed my book complaining that I was a terrible person and a liar because I said that she performed. She performed. But in the family story, they were too respectable to do something as terrible as performing. Being a performer was still, especially for women, was still iffy territory. So they're still mad at me. Now, I talked about, I want to leave room for some questions. So I've been pointing out the Stars and Stripes. Two of the stories that attracted me to Dan Rice in the first place, one was that he was best friends with Abraham Lincoln, the other that he was the model for Uncle Sam. The Uncle Sam figure is a cartoon icon that developed over 30, 40 years. And the one we know now came to final form under the pen of Thomas Nast. Some of you may know Thomas Nast as political cartoonist, helped bring down Tammany Hall. He also gave us our image of Santa Claus, and he gave us our image of Uncle Sam. Now, the difficulty with that story is that Dan Rice was a peace Democrat, a copperhead, a Northern Democrat who thought that the Republicans were ruining the country and that they should just let the South go or find some accommodation with the South. And Thomas Nast was an ardent Republican. So we never would have used Dan Rice consciously as a model. On the other hand, Dan Rice had a goatee. Not totally unusual in the 19th century, but most of the other lots of men had hair on their faces, but it was sideburns, it was mustaches and beards. The solo goatee was not normal. The top hat. He performed in a top hat. If you did a kind of abstract sketch of Dan Rice in the 19th century, and you did just a goatee and a top hat, everybody in the country would have known what you were talking about. So he had those identifying features. He appeared in Stars and Stripes, because those are traditional clown costume kinds of elements. And he also appeared in Top Hat and Tails, when he was the great American humorist. He'd alternate from show to show. So even though Thomas Nast didn't use Dan Rice consciously as a model, nobody has ever fit that model as well as Dan Rice, or been seen by as many Americans at the time as Dan Rice. Because politicians didn't travel. There were no movies. Theater stars didn't travel in the same way. But he was all over the country. Thousands a day in tents, thousands a day in the cities. So, anybody watch Mythbusters? They look at myths and then scientifically compare how it might be accurate or not. If this were Mythbusters, I'd say probably. Then there was the other one, the one that really drew me to, well, there were three things that drew me. One was that his grandfather was a Methodist minister. My grandfather was a Methodist minister. That one was true. Didn't have a whole lot to do with his career, but it was true. Dan Rice is best friends with Abraham Lincoln? No. He spent the Civil War trooping the country, talking about how bad the Republicans were and what a stupid idea this was, and about how bad the South was being abused. I said the whole war. He tended to start not talking about that in 1864, in 1865, when the war started to turn. But Abraham Lincoln certainly knew of Dan Rice, and there is this. There is this. The precursor to the Red Cross was the sanitary fair, and it was they would hold fairs in major cities to raise money, like a state fair. They would raise money to help support the nurses in the field on the battlefield. At the Chicago Sanitary Fair in 1864, Civil War, there were two busts flanking the entrance. Two great American humorists. Dan Rice, this bust, which was, by the way, buried by relatives in, which direction am I? North Dakota. They had to dig it up on a farm in North Dakota. And the other one was Abraham Lincoln. They were the two great American humorists who talked about politics. I talked about starting lanes as successes and failures. America doesn't go from, despite the popular histories, America doesn't go from triumph to triumph. That's not my reading of American history. There are triumphs, and then there are mistakes. There are failures, and then it goes on again. That was one of the lessons for me of the Civil War, at least. So too with people. The immigrants who come. I mentioned Willa Cather. The folks who went to the Nebraska Plains, there's not much out there. It's tough to get a hold there until you figure out the land. And her book is about those who didn't, partly because they were stuck in their ways and weren't willing to change. And there were those who made it. Dan Rice fell from fame for a variety of reasons. But then he went out on lecture tour again in Texas and met his third wife, Marcella Jones Greathouse de Goffredo Robinson Rice. Jones was her maiden name. Greathouse was one of the pioneers of the cattle trails. He died, so she was cattle rich but didn't have a lot of money. She married de Goffredo. He stole her jewels and went to New Orleans. She went to New Orleans and got them back. She was a pistol. She married Robinson. He was a no count, and then he died. And then she married Rice. Her family didn't like it, but she didn't care. She tried to bully her way into the San Antonio Livestock, the Stockmen's Association. She was a pistol. So Dan Rice's representative American isn't the traditional things, he was a clown, we like humor, that kind of thing, but rather the struggle to figure out what you do and how does it work in this country. How can you make a go of it? I'll show this for two reasons. Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay. Those of you old enough remember he was in lots of hot water in the 60s because he said, I'm not going to Vietnam. And this was before lots of people were against the Vietnam War. There's still people mad at him. He changed to a Muslim name because he said Cassius Clay was his slave name. A lot of people didn't like that. But he is still probably the most famous athlete in the world because people look up to him and what he struggled to do with his life, more than just beating people up. And this, by the way, is Clown Alley in Miami. He was in training in Miami for one of his fights, and he came backstage, and I'm in that picture. There I am. Another striver, still trying to figure out what I'm doing. I usually complain about the sentimentality about circus, that it's not for kids and that kind of thing, but I'm a sucker for little kids. That's one of my favorite pictures. So, this is Retke's poem. I really have no sweeping conclusion other than Retke's, which seems to me the song of America. The shaking keeps me steady. I should know. What falls away is always and is near. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. Thank you. I'll translate for you. David has agreed.
David has agreed to take questions. If you have any questions about Dan Rice or about David's life as a clown, questions about politics, humor, sex in the circus. I'm a professional. I can wait. Here's a question.
Are you still a working clown? No. I really haven't worn the stuff much in years. I did go to a reunion of Clown College over in Baraboo about 3 years ago. It was very interesting because I didn't use a lot of brushes. I used my finger to put the makeup on. I didn't realize that when I was learning to do that, my skin was smooth. I'm trying to do it now, and it's like, wait a minute, it's not going on smoothly. I'm glad I practiced before I went.
Well, I just had a question. A very popular book these days is Water for Elephants. And I wonder if you have any comments on that from a historical point of view.
You got another hour? The question is, I guess you heard that. Do I have any comments on Water for Elephants? A couple. I think it's a wonderful story. She's a very good storyteller. Though there is an old circus movie, like silent movie 1920s, that's basically that story. Anyway, besides the possible problems of copying. Historically, the circus has been a home and a haven for what I call the human-animal partnership. There are people who have abused animals on the circus. There are people who have abused animals in other forms. I think the attempt to shut down the circus, and that's what it is, and I think this book is a part of that because people are so mean to elephants, is a misreading of history. I mean, if you shut down every school where one of the teachers did something bad to one of the children, you would have the schools you have now. I mean, there are bad people in the world. So I have trouble with that aspect of it. And historically, the other stuff, there's a whole list of them. For instance, for those of you who've read the book, he needs an elephant. He's not really a circus without an elephant. Not really true. But he found an elephant somewhere else. So rather than having it shipped to him or going himself, he blows his dates. See, a circus, you know, the old thing, the show must go on. The show must go on because that's where you make your money. Making your nut, have you ever heard that expression? It comes from the circus. The nut on a circus wagon, the local farmer, you'd come to town, You didn't have enough money to pay for the hay, for the provisions, so they'd take your nut as security. And then when you paid them at the end of the day, after you got paid, you get the nut back so you can go on to the next town. So, but this guy in this show was advertised in this town, had been advertising for weeks. He's got paying customers coming, and the next day, and he leaves. He's losing all of that money, more than enough to pay for 2 elephants. I mean, it's just silliness. It's just silliness. But it's a wonderful story. It's a lot of fun. And in the movie, the beating of the elephant, even though you know it's fake, is horrendous. It's scary. But I got to say, one of my favorite things of the show was riding an elephant. I love my Lucy.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I'm a 19th century reenactor, and we used your book a lot for our research in mid-19th century theater. But my question to you is, to what extent do you think Dan Rice kept changing to maybe pick up more into middle class, as the middle class was emerging, looking for more respectable types of entertainment? Was Dan playing towards that?
My dissertation. I alluded to it here. The middle class was developing in the 19th century. Before that, there had been the founding fathers, pretty much self-conscious elite, and most people agreed they were the elite, and then most of the rest were what Jefferson celebrated as the solid yeomanry, you know, the good folks. Well, with the growth of industrialism and capitalism, you had the growth of this group in the middle. Managers of factories, clerks, bosses of clerks, department stores. So you had this growth of this middle. The trouble is America is officially non-class. We don't have classes. It's very tough. And so if you ask people, about 90% of the country is middle class, which ignores a lot of economic realities. But as the middle class was developing in the 19th century, I promise I'll make this brief, the middle class was stuck. They couldn't say, we're better than those folks, the way they could in England. They could just say, well, that's the lower classes. You can't say that in this country. And you couldn't say, well, we're better because we make more money than they do, because that's crude, and somebody refined wouldn't do that. So what the middle class developed were these various strategies. This wasn't conscious. It sort of bubbled up as a way of dealing with it. Refinement, aspiration, decorum, all of those things that get us talking quietly and sitting quietly. Like when I was an advanced clown and I'd go to school, sometimes the teachers would say to the kids sitting there, okay, now sit down and be quiet. I'm a clown. I'm supposed to be performing here for these folks, and you're telling them to be quiet? So there are the strategies, kinds of entertainment. Is classical music highbrow or lowbrow? Well, it's highbrow. Ballet is highbrow. But that Gottschalk we heard, that was what everybody heard. I told you what the ballet girls used to be. Shakespeare, highbrow at the time, as it was in his time, popular amusement. Everybody went. Everybody got it. It wasn't some kind of specialized knowledge you needed. So Dan Rice said, I'm not a clown, I'm the great American humorist. He said, this isn't a circus. This isn't one of those vulgar circuses. This is Dan Rice's great show. He said, we aspire to higher things, which is the watchword, the unspoken motto of the middle class. We aspire to higher things. If you read any publicity about theater, somewhere in there is, we're going to do more than entertain. We're aspiring to something higher. What does that mean? Nobody has ever defined it. Art, what does that mean? Other than something on the wall, what it really means is not that. Because if you define it, then you sort of have to defend that yours fits and that doesn't. And then you've caused divisions. But you just say, well, we all know. So Dan Rice was part of that. He was appealing to the growing middle class. And it might have worked. Circus, at least in his hands, might have become one of those highbrow things, like Shakespeare, like ballet, like classical music. But then the Civil War hit. And he talked about politics in the ring. He ran for office from the circus ring. And then the war changed. And the war changed things. So instead of his frank discussion with audiences and dealing with them talking back, he had to get more formal, more polite, and distanced himself from the audience. and he lost that special power he had. But, except for the Civil War, circus might be one of those things like Cirque du Soleil is now. But that's a whole different ball of wax.
Hi, I have read a lot of books on the freak show side of the circus, like tattooed
Freak
men.
show, yeah.
Yeah, the tattooed men and women.
Right.
I was wondering if the tattooed women specifically were seen more as sexual, like you were talking about, or if they were seen more as like freaks, like Hildebrand and those women.
Tattooed women are more a 20th century phenomenon, and actually a more contemporary phenomenon. Not a lot of women got tattoos. Now we're used to tattoos. I hate to sound like an old fart, but when I was a kid, it was bikers and sailors. Nobody else had tattoos. It was a weird thing to do. So I think tattooed women is probably fairly new, but to the extent that there are women in performance, just because of gender politics, they are sexualized. So it was both. They were both that oddity and a woman. There's a great circus song by a clown, Billy Baker. I don't know if it was his or if he just sang it, called Tilly the Tattooed Lady. And with lots of suggestive allusions about the tattoos seen and not seen.